Oddworld is a series that has spanned numerous titles over 2 decades. Despite this, there's only been 5 main Oddworld games, which is actually convenient because YouTube's community tab holding feature only allows 5 options, which I think is a bit limiting, to be honest. Like maybe 10 would be a good number, but whatever. So I did a poll to ask people what their favourite Oddworld game was out of the 5 primary games that have been released so far. Oddworld Abe's Oddysee, Oddworld Abe's Exoddus, Oddworld Munch's Oddysee, Oddworld Strangest Wrath, and of course Oddworld Munch's Oddysee Game Boy Advance version. No, actually Oddworld New and Tasty of course, but it was a close call between the two. I was not sure which one to put. So after nearly 200 votes, which thank you very much for voting as always, the results didn't surprise me much. My favourite Oddworld game is Oddworld Abe's Exoddus, and generally this is considered to be the best Oddworld game. My theory of this is because Oddworld Abe's Oddysee is a masterpiece, but even masterpieces have flaws. Oddworld Abe's Exoddus is basically Oddworld Abe's Oddysee, but where they've seen the flaws with Oddysee and they fixed them. So you've got the same masterpiece, but without the flaws that the original had. Not only that, but Exoddus is bigger than Oddysee, it's longer, and arguably it's more varied. You know, not only did they put in new enemies, iconic enemies such as the flying stigs, the greeters, the fleechers among many more, but they took out all the rubbish ones from Oddysee, you know, like the bats and the bees. They were just extremely annoying. Exoddus introduced possessable scrabs and paramites and farts. It introduced the minecart. You know, there was just so much going on with Exoddus that Oddysee didn't have. I think pretty much the only thing Oddysee has over Exoddus is Elam. I find it surprising they didn't put Elam in Exoddus, but I'm not that bothered about it, to be honest. Actually, writing this now, I'm suddenly having flashbacks and memories of, I think as a child I really used to like Elam a lot or something. I remember after watching Psycho 2, which for some reason I watched before watching the original, I read that a reviewer said of it something like, if it stood on its own, it would be considered a great horror film, but because it's in the shadow of the original, it doesn't seem as good. I think it's the opposite case with Oddysee and Exoddus. Oddysee is considered a great game. Well, it is a great game, in my opinion anyway. You know, won over 100 awards or something like that, and is considered a classic, and has easily got a more recognisable name. But in polls, it has always come second to its sequel, Abe's Exoddus, because Exoddus takes what made Oddysee great and stamps out any of the problems that were in the first game. But to be fair, without Oddysee there wouldn't be Exoddus. Exoddus wouldn't have been able to fix the problems if Oddysee hadn't pointed them out. So it's sort of a cohabitational situation, whereby Exoddus is generally considered better than Oddysee, but the reasons it's considered better than Oddysee is because of Oddysee. It's still worth noting though, that Abe's Oddysee is still way above any of the other games in the series in the poll, and even though it's far from the percentage of the vote that Exoddus got, it's still the closest any of the other games get us to touching it. And it is notable that Abe's Exoddus got such a large portion of the vote, a landslide, a mudslide. 61% is over the majority, very much over the majority. About 116 people voted for Oddworld Abe's Exoddus. It's amazing how almost undisputedly Abe's Exoddus always comes up as the conglomeration of fans' favourite by such a massive amount. And the irony, of course, is that Lorne Lanning considers it to be his least favourite in the series, saying Abe's Exoddus is where the Oddworld franchise started going downhill for him. But I think he's sort of talking about the behind the scenes of it and not necessarily about the final product. I think the reasons he considers it to be bad have nothing to do and are completely different to the reasons the fans think it's good. I think he's talking about how like Abe's Exoddus was sort of the first time Oddworld Inhabitants was under major pressure to get a game out and all that sort of thing. So you know, obviously it was really stressful, and while Abe's Exoddus, at least in my opinion, didn't suffer at all due to the time constraints they were under when making it, future Oddworld games did, like Munch's Oddysee, which I'll get onto later. So I think it's more of a personal behind the scenes thing for why Lorne considers it his least favourite. I think he said it was his least favourite anyway, I could be wrong about that, but either way, his feelings towards Oddworld Abe's Exoddus are apparently in complete contrast with what the apparent majority of the fans think in considering it the most favourite Oddworld game. Now going to the opposite side of the spectrum, Oddworld New and Tasty got the least amount of votes, which again doesn't surprise me at all. You know, unlike Abe's Oddysee, New and Tasty had quite a lot of criticism directed at it, I think. It's a remake of Oddworld Abe's Oddysee, but in my opinion it doesn't quite match up somehow to Abe's Oddysee. I think it's a good example of how technology doesn't always matter. You can have all the modern technology and graphics and all that of the modern era, but still the end result will be subpar compared to something created, you know, 23 years ago. In relation to this poll, in some ways I think it's quite fascinating that New and Tasty got as high a proportion of the vote as it did. 6% or 11 votes or so. You know, it's quite interesting that there are a number of people out there who prefer New and Tasty to the original, and to any of the other Oddworld games. I always say New and Tasty doesn't quite match up to Abe's Oddysee, but it did its job. It was designed to introduce a new generation that doesn't remember the original games to the Oddworld universe. It brought attention back onto Oddworld inhabitants and marked the new start of the new era of Oddworld going into the mainstream again. So I wonder if the people that consider New and Tasty the best Oddworld game, or their favourite rather, are people that first experienced Oddworld through New and Tasty. After all, obviously it could potentially be immensely hard to go back to the original if you've never played it before after having only experienced New and Tasty. So I guess it makes sense that there are some people out there that do consider it their favourite Oddworld game. For me personally, the biggest surprise of the poll came in the form of the results of the middle children. Oddworld Munch's Oddysee narrowly beat Oddworld Stranger's Wrath. This I find very fascinating because traditionally, when polls such as this have been conducted in the past, that I've seen anyway, I think it's always generally been Abe's Exoddus at the top, followed by Abe's Oddysee, Stranger's Wrath, and then Munch's Oddysee. For some reason I think Munch's Oddysee has always sort of been the bullied child of the Oddworld franchise. I guess until New and Tasty came along, which is a shame because I like Munch's Oddysee a lot. I've always been quite a defender for it. But there's some people that really hate Munch's Oddysee. I can also understand that side of things as well. It definitely wasn't, in my opinion, as good as I was hoping, and I think it was a case of Oddworld inhabitants doing what they do best, and hyping things up perhaps too much, and unfortunately in this case they didn't quite deliver what even they had intended. Like, I don't think it was just the fans that were disappointed with Munch's Oddysee, but I also think Oddworld inhabitants likely were as well, because it wasn't what it could have been and what they wanted it to be. It was originally meant to be way bigger and way different to how it turned out, and I think it's the biggest tragedy in Oddworld's history that they didn't end up doing what they'd intended. That being said, I still think it was a good game, but I'm not that critical of a person, I guess. I really have to hate something in order to dislike something, I think, otherwise I'm just like, meh. In fact, I've only just realised that this poll actually reflects my personal list, at least in terms of order, of my favourite Oddworld games. You know, Abe's Exoddus, Oddysee, then Munch's Oddysee, and then Stranger's Wrath, and finally New and Tasty. And it occurs to me that there seems to be two sort of sects, two tribes if you like. The first type is the type that I usually see in other polls that have been done over the years, that traditionally would put Stranger's Wrath ahead of Munch's Oddysee. And then there's the other type, of which I consider myself, that skews more towards the Abe side of Oddworld, and is more dedicated to that, and sees Stranger's Wrath as a great game, but you know, it's a spin-off, it's not really a part of the main series, and the gameplay is significantly different as well. So while it is Oddworld, it's sort of, for me anyway, too far astray from what is traditionally an Oddworld game, if that makes sense. At least for me anyway. It is a different flavour of brew made from the same tears. I like Oddworld Stranger's Wrath a lot. I think it's a very fun game, and with a really good story. Definitely a lot of action and strategy, and quite rightly so, a lot of people really like it. It definitely has its roots in Oddworld, you can tell it's an Oddworld game. But here's a better way of saying what I was trying to say earlier. There's one tribe that would like to see the Oddworld franchise skew more towards that type of game, whereas the other type of fan would like it to steer more in the direction of like the Abe games and whatever. Obviously now I guess this whole idea is pretty irrelevant because of Oddworld Soulstorm, that arguably seems to be in some ways mixing the two sides together a bit. I think I've mainly got this idea of the two tribes in my head from like 10 years ago, when I think Oddworld inhabitants didn't even know what direction they were going to go in. They were just busy making HD remakes or whatever. That basically sums up the poll, I guess. So results for me were pretty expected. New and Tasty got the least amount of votes, but to be fair, Stranger's Wrath and Munch's Oddysee are literally 1% between each other and New and Tasty. So it's interesting that if you combine Exoddus and Oddysee, that's a massive 78% of the vote. People love the Abe games, and that seems to be what people think of when they think of Oddworld. It's certainly what I think of anyway. I hope Oddworld inhabitants have taken notice of this over years, and truly are going to go back more to their Abish roots with Oddworld Soulstorm.
Hello, follow me. Yo.